Hello, and thanks for joining us today for this IT Pro TV webinar. We will be live tweeting during the webinar at #ProsKnow. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Questions not answered during the webinar will be answered on Twitter with the #ProsKnow. Now let's get started.
Greetings and welcome to the IT Pro TV webinar series, shot live at the IT Pro TV studios. And I'm your host, Justin Dennison, here with our presenter, Mr. Don Pizzette. Let me tell you a little bit about Don. He has over 20 years in IT. He's certified in Microsoft, Google, CompTIA, Cisco, and I'm sure there's a plethora of other ones we couldn't fit on the slide. And he's also a co-founder here at IT Pro TV, as well as being an edutainer. And speaking of IT Pro TV, let me tell you a little bit about IT Pro TV. We have IT training for every stage of your career. Whether you're a budding professional or a seasoned one, we have something for you. We have CompTIA, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple, Linux. If you need training, we probably have something that fits your training requirements. Our interactive two-host format will keep you engaged. Well, let's just say there's been times where I'm going, all right, I got to speed this up because I can't pay attention. Not here. We have something that'll draw your attention to us. And for me, I know preparing for either a lab environment or exams can sometimes be very nerve-wracking or anxiety-producing. We have virtual labs and practice exams included with our subscriptions, as well as team and individual plans, whether you're you're just getting started by yourself or you need something for your company. And well, I know that you're here to figure out how to migrate to the cloud successfully. So let's go ahead and welcome Mr. Don Pizzette. How are you doing today, Don?
I am doing great. I'm glad you qualified it as migrating to the cloud successfully.
Yeah.
Our other webinar on how to perform a disastrous migration didn't go so well.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually a disaster. We had things streaming. Somebody unplugged something, and then I was like, well, there we go. Any questions?
Well, there are a lot of companies that have failed in their migration, hit roadblocks, had to back up and undo things. We want to help you avoid that. And really, if you divide up all the different moving parts that it takes to get moved into the cloud, there really boils down to about 8 steps that you can perform that help to make sure that you're as successful as possible, or if anything goes wrong, that you only have to roll back a minimal amount to correct for it before rolling forward again, thus being successful. So that's what we're going to run into right here in this webinar. I do want to mention right here at the start that we're kind of going platform agnostic on this one. So whether it's Azure or AWS or Google Compute, it's really the same basic process for all of them. But that doesn't mean it's a one-size-fits-all. Like, you can't say Google Compute works for everybody. There are certain providers that are better. So we have to make sure that we get the right answer for our environment to make sure we're choosing appropriately. And that's kind of where we're going to start here with our 8 steps. The very first step is probably the most important and one that a lot of companies skip and then end up regretting down the road. And that's that you need to answer a very important question. Are you even allowed to go to the cloud? Because not everybody is. And I know that sounds weird, like I'm allowed, I'm not, like I can do whatever I want. Well, if you have legal requirements around the data that you contain or regulatory compliance that you have to uphold, if there are rules in place that dictate where you're allowed to store that data or how you're allowed to store that data, you might not be able to move into the cloud. And cloud solutions have come a long way over the last few years, and we're seeing they've been PCI compliant for a long time, but now they're starting to offer HIPAA compliance or isolated government networks. So it's opening up to a lot more people, but it's still not opened up to everyone. There are going to be situations where you might not be allowed to do that. So before you entertain doing a cloud migration, you'll want to check with your legal department. You'll want to get advice on that to make sure that you're allowed to do it, as well as doing your due diligence and examining the various cloud providers that you pick. And the same thing kind of applies to the way that the hardware is being provisioned. When you go to AWS or Google Compute, one of the ways they keep their costs so low, the reason it's so much more affordable than using our own servers, is that they do a multi-tenancy deployment model. You're running virtual machines on the same hardware as other people. Those other people might be your competition. They might be malicious actors. They could be anybody. You don't know who they are. And there are a number of exploits that are out there, things like the Spectre and Meltdown attacks that could potentially allow one customer access to another customer's data. If you're pushing medical records, that's really, really bad. So you may not even be allowed to do the migration in the first place if you require dedicated hardware. But if you require dedicated hardware, a lot of the cloud providers do actually offer that. Amazon has reserved instances that you can do, or actually they're called dedicated instances that you can do where you have the hardware underneath and it's only you provisioning on it. But it's something that you'll need to plan for from day one. So always evaluate that. All right, the second part is kind of an extension of that same step. Is once we figure out whether or not we're allowed to, then we can figure out whether it's even feasible for us to do it. There's two big changes that you're going to experience when you move things into the cloud. And the first is your budget, right? Normally, when you're running your own data center, you're dealing with, and I'm going to use accounting terms here, which I'm terrible at, but capital expenditures, right, or CapEx, where you're buying physical servers, 100% of the server, and you're running it, right? So it's something that the accountants can easily plan for, an upfront cost. But when you go to the cloud, it's a pay-as-you-go model. So you're paying each month for what you use. It becomes a far less predictable expense. It becomes more of an operational expense, or an OpEx, CapEx, OpEx, all that crazy stuff. This is why we hire accountants. So maybe that should be our second step, is hire an accountant. But the budget is going to be changing. So you need to understand whether or not you've got that approved in your budget, or if you can reasonably forecast what those fees are going to be to make sure that you can allot for that. And also your physical hardware requirements. When I say you might have specialized physical hardware on premises that is not available in the cloud. A great example of that would be like those write once DVD backup solutions, or fax boards. There's plenty of companies that have fax servers still, and so they have special modem boards in them to connect to a bunch of phone lines. Hardware like that is not available in the cloud. You might have software that requires a hardware dongle. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Justin, where like your software license is actually tied to a dongle.
I used to do that whenever I dabbled in 3D modeling and stuff, like 3ds Max. Used to have a dongle where you had to like plug it in, and if you took it out, it wouldn't launch. There were several things that I had earlier on in my career where there was a physical dongle, and if you didn't have it, it didn't work.
Absolutely, and in the enterprise space, that stuff is more and more likely to come across your table. So in those scenarios, you need to reach out to the vendor and say, hey, have you come up with a way, a virtual dongle, because that's usually what they do. Have you come up with a virtual dongle that I can use in my cloud deployment? If you haven't, I can't license the software. I have to run it on premises at that point. So this would be another blocker to even moving to the cloud in the first place. But we've got to make sure we answer the question, and we need to know that, because otherwise we can start our migration, start moving forward, and all of a sudden we hit this one server and we're like, oops, I guess we got to back off now. Or, do we roll back the whole thing? Do we roll back part of it? What is it? It just becomes a mess. So this is all stuff we have to get up front. All right, after that, we're ready for the real heavy lifting, okay? So if we know that we're allowed to go to the cloud, and we know that we can, right? We've got the means to do it, we're ready to pick a cloud provider. And honestly, this is a question I get asked practically every single day. It's a rare day that somebody doesn't come to me and say, Don, are you an AWS guy? Do you prefer Azure? Do you prefer Google Compute? Which one should we go with? And there's plenty of other ones out there like DigitalOcean and Packet and so on. Which one's the right one? All right. Well, the short answer is kind of a cop-out, which is that there's not necessarily a right one. A lot of them are kind of reaching feature parity. Amazon has a bit of a head start over the other providers because they've been in it longer. They've got the majority of the market share. But like Microsoft Azure has really been catching up. And so what it boils down to is you've got to sit down and figure out the features that are offered by each one. Azure has some features, Google has some, Amazon has some, and there's a lot that's equal between them. Like if I just want to bring up a Postgres database, I want a fully managed Postgres database. All three vendors have that. Or MySQL, all three have that. But if there's something specialized that I want, like video encoding services that Amazon has quite a bit of, but then Azure doesn't. And so now we can kind of eliminate cloud providers. And it's not so much figuring out which cloud provider is right for you, it's figuring out which ones are wrong. I can't go with this provider because they're missing a particular feature. At the end of the day, if you kind of narrow that list down and you get down to about 2-3 cloud providers and they all have the features that you need, at that point, you need to start evaluating other requirements that might make you choose one vendor over another. For example, if you say, I want a vendor that I can call on the phone and get help from. Well, we can just scratch Google right off the list because Google doesn't talk to their customers ever. So, those are things we have to think about. It's important.
Oops. Yeah. And I guess at some point we're probably going to be considering cost if we have this core feature set within each of the cloud providers, right?
Yeah, cost is a concern, right? And we want to make a choice on this where we get the best platform possible, but you've only got so much in the way of a budget available. So you've got to kind of pick and choose based on what's there. Now, I'll tell you, most of them have pricing that's very similar. If it's different, it's usually off by a couple of cents. So it kind of works out in the end. But you've got to understand your requirements, what you need, and then what you want. And so a lot of times having a lower cost is something we kind of want, but don't necessarily need. Most companies are willing to pay a little extra if they're getting exactly the service that they require. So you need to understand things like locations, right? If I need servers around the globe, well, some providers like Amazon, like Microsoft, like Packet, they have points of presence or POPs all over the globe. They really cover that. But then when you start looking at other providers, people like Media Temple. Media Temple is a great service, but they only have a handful of data centers. I think they have like 6 total. So it's not as much. And so those are things that you use to narrow it down and find the right provider. Back in the 80s, there was always that saying, like, nobody ever got fired for choosing IBM, right? Because they were the market leader. And that's kind of how it is today with AWS. Nobody's ever gotten fired for choosing AWS. So if you had to take a total stab in the dark, that's a pretty safe bet. But Microsoft has done a phenomenal job with Azure. And Google, aside from horrible customer service, has actually been doing really good building up their platform. So it all boils down to the same basic service at the end of the day. All right, I've been making fun of Google. I love Google. I use a lot of Google products, but I will tell you, they are a testament in not providing support to customers. And that's my next step, which is whichever provider you choose, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Google, whoever, you need to document the support structure, right? Something is going to go wrong. That's a given. Something's going to go wrong during your migration. Something's going to go wrong down the road after you're in full production. It's going to happen. And you need to know who to reach out to ask for assistance. Now, this is where you have to make a hard choice. The bigger the company, usually the worse their support becomes. And that's why, companies like Google, they're so massive that it's just difficult to reach out and get help from. Versus a smaller company, somebody like Media Temple, you can call them right up on the phone. You can actually pay extra to get skipped to the front of the line and talk to their higher end techs. And that's really nice, but it's a smaller company. That's why they have that. But whichever one you choose, you need to be able to answer the all-important question, who you're going to call. And it's not going to be the Ghostbusters because they don't really help with the cloud so much. But it is going to be whoever that provider is. So you've got to have that phone number. You've got to have that email address, the forum, whatever it is that you're going to interact with them to get support because you're going to need it. And if you pick a bigger provider like AWS or Azure, it's actually pretty easy to find other people, just regular people in your IT community that are trained in that product that can come and help. If you're looking for consultants, you can find AWS consultants left and right. But it's harder to find somebody that's got more experience with a smaller provider. So now somebody would have to come in to help you and they would have to learn that platform while they're trying to solve your problems. That's not really ideal, but you've got to make sure you've got that documented.
And Don, this is something where depending on the provider, we need to make sure there are sometimes support levels that we can either opt in through price or by the services that we may use. We need to be aware that sometimes there's differences between those of what will be helped for us, right?
Absolutely. And let me use Media Temple as an example. I've worked with Media Temple on a handful of projects over the years, and they provide a normal level of service. They have SLAs, service level agreements. They guarantee a certain amount of uptime, and a guarantee is not really worth much. If it goes down, they just credit your bill a little bit. You still had downtime. They don't magically make that go away. But you could pay extra for a higher end of support with them to be able to skip to the front of the line and get that help. And it was really cool because if we had a server that started behaving weird, right? Maybe I saw unusual CPU utilization on it. You could actually call them, get a human being within a minute and say, hey, I've got this one instance that's experiencing high CPU. Can you take a look at it for me? And they would do that. Or once a month, you'd get a call from them and they'd say, hey, a new update is out for this library and we noticed you haven't applied it yet. I remember when Heartbleed happened, they called us and said, hey, would you mind if we patched your service for Heartbleed? Absolutely, right? That's not going to happen with AWS. So you you get what you pay for with this stuff, but sometimes these services aren't even available. You need to go and look at it. And a quick word about AWS. They are the market leader. They actually do have a really good support team. But one thing that you might not notice is that when you sign up for an AWS account and you start spinning up instances, you actually don't qualify for support. You could be paying them thousands of dollars a month and you don't qualify for support. And that's because that's billed as a separate service. AWS is always pay for what you use. And so they don't put support into the base package. You have to choose to pay for that as an add-on. So evaluate that with whatever provider it is and put that together into a support book so you know exactly who to call when things go wrong. All right, let's move on to our next step. And this is, I guess if we're keeping track of our numbers here, we're on step number 5. So at this point, we've chosen a provider. We know who to call for support. We've got all that in order, but we haven't actually moved anything yet. So now it's time to move, okay? There are some people that go all in. They just say, look, I'm going to move all of my servers into the cloud in one big move. And I'll tell you, I've seen a number of projects like that. I've actually seen one that was successful. Most people that try and do an all over, just cut over all at once, it seems like one of the easier paths, but it just, there's so many things that can go wrong. And the more servers you have, the more applications you have, the more things that can absolutely go wrong. So it's better if you do baby steps, right? Little bits at a time. Don't migrate everything in your environment, right? Not all at once. You will over time, but in the beginning, start with just one system, one service or software application, one physical server or something like that, and just migrate that one piece over. Now, in order to do that, to have one thing in the cloud and everything else on premises, you need some kind of connection to allow your internal users to see that as still being internal, even though now it's remote. And this is where a lot of the vendors will have VPN solutions that are available that can connect from, for example, your firewall up to a VPC in AWS. And when that happens, those cloud services will still look like they're locally reachable, even though they're remote. By doing that, it gives you a chance to kind of test the waters with that provider and learn with a non-critical system. So maybe I take something like a backup archive, and I use that as my first test, and I move that into AWS. If it doesn't work out so well, it was my backup archive. So my production servers are still fine. So, that's not such a big deal. And then I can bring it back to on-premises. And maybe it was such a bad test that I decide I'm not going to go with that cloud provider. I can switch to a new one, migrate that same one system over and try it again, right? So you do that until you settle into a routine. You learn that provider a little bit. And I encourage you to go really slow. Move that one server in and then let it run for a week or a month even, because you don't necessarily know what it's going to take for you on the support side and dealing with that platform. It gives you a chance to kind of learn it. And once you've seen that work, now you can start moving a few more things. And what you're in now is a hybrid cloud. You have your on-premises equipment and you've got some non-critical things up in the cloud to make sure that everything works. And only when that's done and you're confident in the knowledge that you've chosen appropriately, are you ready to kind of move to that 6th step, which is transition your critical systems. Now we can take our mission critical stuff, things like our email servers, our web servers, and so on, and start moving them into the cloud. Now, we want to move them because they will benefit from what's in the cloud. You have better power redundancy and network bandwidth, available bandwidth. You have a global network that you can reach out with. You have Amazon or Microsoft or Google taking care of all the hardware underneath. Those are all benefits that we get. And our critical servers can really benefit from taking advantage of that. So we're going to move them over. Now, how you move over is going to depend on your systems, right? You may just be able to do a re-implementation. And what that means is if I have an email server, let's say I have a send mailbox or something like that here on my own network, I could spin up an all new send mailbox up in the cloud. And then when I had it all configured and all set up the way that I wanted, I could change my MX records to point over to the cloud one and off it goes, right? I basically rebuilt it from scratch. Or you could use migration tools. And actually, there's a number of companies, VMware is one of the bigger ones, where they've started releasing tools that will take your on-premises server and convert it into a virtual machine that can then be sent up into AWS. So you're not re-implementing it. You're not rebuilding it from scratch. You're actually just converting the old one and moving it over. Microsoft Azure, Amazon's AWS, they all have tools like that if you go and look in the documentation. Now, let me give you a word of caution on these. do not trust those tools. They're great. And if they worked exactly like they say, that would be wonderful. And migrating to the cloud would be super easy. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you take a physical machine and convert it to a virtual. There's a lot of drivers and other leftover software that kind of gets stuck in there. Like if you have HP Proliant servers, right? You might have those remote insight boards that are built into them. And so you've got software that drives a lot of that. And when you migrate a virtual machine, those drivers aren't really useful anymore. They can cause problems. So they've got to be stripped out. And the tools try and do that, but they're not perfect. So you're going to end up spending a lot of time checking and double checking to make sure the implementation is correct. And a lot of times it's easier to just set it up where you just rebuild the server from scratch. Now, there's other solutions like Azure has the Azure Cloud Backup or Azure Site Recovery, where you can run these little backup utilities on all of your on-premises servers, and it will automatically build up virtual machines to mirror them. And when you're backing up, you're actually backing up to these virtual machines. And when you're ready to migrate, you just flip the failover switch, and you say, I'm going to fail over from on-prem to cloud, which is your backup. And once that happens, the cloud goes from backup to production, and your on-prem goes from production to backup. And you just migrated to the cloud, right? Just by flipping a little switch. It actually takes a lot of work to get that set up, but that is one technique that you can use. But you need to test those servers in the cloud extensively to make sure they migrated properly before you just push all your production traffic over to it, especially if they're mission critical systems.
And Don, with these mission critical systems, this is something that we should still let them veg for like a week or so. I know for me, whenever I've had to move things, I'm like, it looks like it's doing fine. A week later, we find out that, this isn't logging appropriately, or, hey, this never sends that report to anybody anymore, which, maybe it's not a big deal, but maybe it's, whoops, we've now violated our contractual obligations or something.
You want to know the one that always gets me? The end of the month, right? As an IT guy, the end of the month doesn't mean anything to me. What do I care? The month is over, a new month's about to roll in. But if you're in sales or accounting, there's a lot of stuff that happens on the last day of the month or the first day, depending on how you do it. There's a lot of reports that get run, a lot of activity in the system. And so when I look at performance reports, I've had to learn over the years, I can't just look at the last 2 weeks of activity. I need to look at the last few months of activity, because you'll find where there's spikes in traffic. So you may have specced out virtual machines that have a certain amount of memory and a certain amount of CPU and a certain amount of network bandwidth that's fine for your normal traffic. And all of a sudden the end of month hits and you get walloped and the network is slow and people are complaining saying, I thought the cloud was supposed to be faster. I thought this was supposed to be, move us back on-prem. It was faster on premises. And it's just because you didn't account for that spike in traffic. So that's all an important thing to kind of evaluate. And so that at that point, you moved a few test servers over just to kind of see how things went. And then you've moved some critical servers over. Critical servers you don't want to move very often. So once they're in the cloud, at that point, you are pretty much a cloud-based company, but we're not done there. You don't want to stop, right? You want to evaluate whatever remaining servers that you have. I lacked creativity on this step and just called it transition remaining services. Whatever services are left, right? So if you have, maybe you moved your mail server, you moved your web server, but there's some old file server laying around that you don't really use anymore, but it still exists because who knows when you'll need a file off of it. Well, now's the time to move anything that's left. If you choose to, you may skip this step and say, you know what, I've got some remaining services, but I'm going to keep them on premises because they're already paid for. I've already bought the server. I'm not going to upgrade it. It's a legacy system anyway, so I'll just leave it here. But if it's something that you're having to maintain, now's the chance to get in and move that into the cloud and get that put up there. So with these types of systems, it is almost always easier to re-implement because your remaining services are the servers that typically get neglected. They're usually running older operating systems or hardware that may not transition exactly well. This is a great chance to update, refresh, or replace those, right? But we can re-implement those up in the cloud. If we choose to leave them on premises, that's fine, but we'll want to keep that connection up between our on-premises deployment and the cloud solution. And that way your cloud servers can still reach out to these secondary servers and access the resources. I know there's plenty of places that even maintain that set of secondary servers as their like offsite backup, which kind of brings me to my last one, which is implement a second provider. Now, having all of your systems in the cloud is great. You get a lot of redundancy out of it, but no cloud provider is perfect. They've all had outages. Amazon's had outages, Azure's had outages, Google Compute has had a number of outages. So, they happen. You can't design a perfect system, but I'll tell you, they're all doing great jobs at it. They've had less outages than I have at a number of companies. So they're doing a phenomenal job. But if you deploy and you put all of your resources in one cloud provider, and that cloud provider goes offline, right? And it could be as simple as a bad BGP route gets pushed into the update tables, and all of a sudden that cloud provider's offline. All of your services just went offline. So you can keep your on-premise solution as a backup, right? And now if the cloud provider goes down, you still have things implemented on-premise, so you're okay. You might be running slower at lower capacity, but at least you're up and running. But what I recommend is once you get everything moved into that cloud provider, pick a second cloud provider. So if you've got everything in AWS, take a look at Azure or Google Compute and set them up as a disaster recovery location. You've got numerous data centers available in whatever provider you pick, but when you start diversifying across those data centers, they are still all within the same provider space. And there's always going to be some kind of weakness there, no matter how much redundancy they build in. So start looking at the other providers. Now, Justin, I want to kind of pitch this one at you. When we work with AWS, which we use here at IT Pro TV, there's extensive command line tooling and API calls and things like that we use, like if you're using Terraform to deploy inside of AWS, that if we then want to deploy inside of Azure, a lot of that doesn't carry over, right? So in your opinion, like how big of a headache is that trying to retool for a different platform?
So, well, let's take Terraform, for instance. If you use one of the cloud provider specific tools, like CloudFormation and AWS, you just got to start from scratch, right? You have the JSON templating inside of Azure. I think Google's got something similar. It may end up being, oh, well, we recommend Kubernetes. But in the context of Terraform, you have similar services. You still have to move things over, but at least everything's still set up. You can work with workspaces. You can try to keep them in parity as you go, even if you're not deploying to Azure. I like third-party tools for that. From the command line perspective, I have seen kind of this convergence between the G Cloud tool, the Azure Cloud tool, and the AWS CLI. They're getting very similar in kind of how you format things. So if you're using Bash scripts or PowerShell scripts that use those tools, that wouldn't actually be as much of an issue. It's a nightmare to manage a really complex service with those, though.
Absolutely. And, there's a number of tools out there like Puppet and Chef that people were thinking were going to die off once the cloud really popularized. Well, they found a spot for themselves. Both of them, Puppet and Chef, have started releasing updates where they allow you to provision on Azure and on AWS and on Google Compute. So now you write a runbook once, and it can run across each of those different platforms. So deploying on more than one cloud provider is no longer a nightmare. There's actually a lot of easy ways to do that. Not if you're using that particular cloud provider's tools, but if you use third-party tools like Puppet, Chef, or any number of other ones that are out there, you can do it. Also, containers are helping a bit with that. If you're leveraging Kubernetes, that can help out as well as making it consistent. Microsoft Azure has been making a big push to offer Kubernetes support. Google is all in on Kubernetes, so Google Compute has it, and Amazon is offering it as well. So those are all things that start to kind of even the playing field. So do not hesitate to use a second provider, right? Yeah, you can use DNS records that direct people to different providers. You can point them at load balancers at each different provider, and then that provides access inside of those networks. And you can get some amazing, phenomenal redundancy. Even if Microsoft's entire network were to go down, you could still have your AWS assets up.
And this is, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, I would consider this during my choice of cloud provider, particularly if I'm using one of those unicorn services, right? Don said that we have near feature parity, correct, for those core services, but then you have that one-off where they're like, but we have this and no one else has it. Well, if you make use of that in your technology, how are you going to flip over? What if it goes down? I'm trying to think of like Cosmos DB in Azure, which provides all these interfaces, graph, document, NoSQL, SQL. Yeah, that's great, but what is the solution if you have to back up or move over? So, I mean, that's a globally distributed one, so maybe that's not the greatest one, but you never know.
Amazon Aurora,
yep,
right? So their version of MySQL that has multiple write replicas. And if you send it over to another provider, you lose that, and so now at a minimum, your capacity would drop significantly because you leverage that technology. So that's all stuff you definitely need to plan for. But that's basically the 8 steps we need to go through. So let's recap those just real quick. First off, we need to find out if we're allowed to go to the cloud in the first place, because we might not be. And then we need to figure out if we can, right? If we've got the budget and the resources available, as well as any physical requirements that might preclude us from moving over. We need to select which cloud provider we're going to use based on our requirements. We need to document the support that's available. So if something goes wrong, we know who to contact and what to do to kind of overcome that limitation. Then we need to do a hybrid deployment. Pick some non-critical servers to move over as part of our test, see how that goes, make sure everything works out. When it does, we move on to the next step, which is move our critical servers, get them into the cloud. Lastly, or second to last, we can start to move any remaining services, transition them over into the cloud as well. And at that point, our cloud provisioning is done. And then our last step, look to that second cloud provider. See if we can diversify to make sure that we can survive even corporate outages at that cloud provider level.
Well, Don, we tried to make sure we covered all of our bases, but like always, people do have questions. We have some questions coming in. And Janice from Denver says, do you know of any evaluation tools to help you choose between Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud?
It's a good question. It certainly would be nice to have a software tool that I could run that could just tell me like, oh yeah, Google Compute's the best one for you, or Azure would work better. But the reality is the tooling, it doesn't know how your network functions. It looks at basic things like how much CPU utilization you're using, or how much RAM, how much disk space. And honestly, all the providers give you that stuff. So a software tool isn't really going to be able to tell that. Azure and AWS, I'm not sure about Google, but I know Azure and AWS, they have a migration tool you can run that will scan your network and help tell you whether or not everything you do is supported up in the cloud. But it's not like one tool you run. You'd have to get the tool from Azure and run it, get the tool from Google and run it. And at the end of the day, it's just going to tell you whether you can or can't. It's not going to tell you one is better than the other. There are some tools like, is it Veeam or VM, VEEAM, where they have some tooling, because they do multi-cloud deployments, and they can scan your environment, give you some feedback there too. VMware has actually been putting out a few things that help, but none of them are going to tell you one provider is better than another, or at least none that I've seen so far.
All right. Well, that's a tricky topic indeed. Emilio from Little Rock asked, generally, do costs go down, go up, or stay the same when you move to the cloud? I'm trying to build a case internally and wondering if that's an angle.
Yeah. Assuming you don't screw it up, then costs generally go down. When you buy a physical server, you pay for 100% of that server on day one. And then if you use 100% of it, great. But on days when you're not using it, when that server's running at 20% CPU, you're still paying for 100% of it because you bought it outright. In the cloud, you're not. When your CPU utilization lowers, you can scale back your instances and you start saving money. You can't do that with physical servers. But there's also a lot of incidental costs that people don't think about, like your power bill. You're not paying to power those servers anymore. That's wrapped up in your cloud cost. Network redundancy, power grid redundancy, generators, UPSs, warranties on the hardware, just general maintenance like that. That's all stuff that you're not paying for anymore. It's wrapped up into the cloud cost. So if you sit down and do a true accounting and add up all the stuff that you're paying for to maintain those servers, including square footage in the building and air conditioning and all that, and compare that to a cloud cost, it is almost always lower. But you do have to be careful because you could slip up and say, well, I'm in the cloud, I can provision whatever I want. You used to be constrained by hardware. Now with no limit, you can start to have server creep. You start deploying more and more resources, occupying more storage, and all of a sudden your costs can go up. But as long as you're maintaining an apples for apples, like keeping the services at the same level as on premises, it is almost always less expensive. And the reason I have to say almost is when you deploy in AWS, for example, you pick a region, and there are some regions that are significantly more expensive than others. So if you're picking like North Virginia or Ireland or Ohio, those are pretty affordable. But then when you pick one like Australia or Japan, those are more expensive. And so you've got to look there. But even in those cases, they end up usually being less expensive.
And that's one of those, I'm guilty of this. You're like, I just turn it up, right? Just add more servers. But sometimes you got to take a step back, just like you would if you had limited resources and say, why is my CPU utilization 100%? Like, should we address the root cause? Is it something we're doing instead of, we'll just add another server?
Somebody's Bitcoin mining.
Oh, no. But we do have more questions. Jason from Austin, Texas asked, do you see Google Cloud's market share growing?
It has grown some, but not significantly, and not in like a huge amount. They're growing in one-digit numbers right now. Google was late to the game. Amazon had a huge head start. Microsoft was a little bit late, but Microsoft dumped a ton of money into ramping Azure up, and you saw that their growth was ridiculous. So, they are really, really competitive. But Google Compute is so far behind. They have less than 10% of the market share, and they're growing in that single digit range. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen there. I do know, and I joke about it, but I'm gonna stand behind this one. I do know that Google has some of the worst customer service in the industry. So it's hard to sell people on that. come do business with us. We're never going to talk to you, but come on, we'll do business. It'll be great. And that kind of hamstrings them a little bit. For them, they don't worry about it so much. They need those servers anyway to power their own services. So it's really just kind of icing on the cake for them, generating extra revenue. But there's a lot of a risk in that environment. I don't know that Google's really got their heart in the game on that one. Personally, I don't usually choose them. I have done a lot of deployments in AWS. Most of mine are AWS, but I've done deployments in Azure, DigitalOcean. I mentioned Media Temple, Rackspace, a number of other ones that are out there. Companies like Rackspace, they are dedicated to offering that cloud service, and they have that fanatical support. They do a great job because that's what they do. Google, they're a search engine company, and they want to gather analytics for marketing, and the server stuff. It's just something they're kind of doing on the side. You could say the same about Amazon, though, and they do a great job.
Yeah, that's one of those tricky questions. And I guess ultimately it depends on the services that you want and the experience that you're looking for. From a developer kind of bent, I enjoy DigitalOcean, but I don't typically need very many different services, and it fits my needs. So I like that experience. But if you need some better tooling or a little more oomph, then you probably want to go with AWS or Azure. And well, we have another question. Albert from Raleigh, North Carolina. Are you familiar with the dedicated connection options Direct Connect, Express Route, Interconnect? And if you are, what are the pros and cons?
All right. So I get lost in the jargon sometimes, but I am familiar with several of the connection models. Some of them are simply a VPN connection, right? VPN connections are nice because they don't really require specialized hardware. On the AWS side or Azure side or whatever, they'll create a VPN endpoint on your hardware, your firewall, your router, whatever. You establish a tunnel. Sometimes they make it a super pain in the butt and make you run BGP to connect up the autonomous systems. Other times they just let you do a simple static route to point to your network on the other side. And now you've got an encrypted connection over your existing network, right? Over your existing WAN link to be able to connect up to that provider. Those are cool because they have such a low difficulty level, a low barrier to entry. So they work out really well. But performance is not necessarily the greatest. And if you've got users who are used to experiencing their email server on-prem, and all of a sudden their email server's in the cloud, they'll notice that, right? The extra couple of milliseconds of latency or the lower bandwidth. You might have a full gigabit LAN and only 100 megabit internet connection, or maybe it is a gigabit internet connection, but everybody's sharing that connection. So people will notice that slowdown. And that's where things like Direct Connect come in, where you can actually reach out to a couple of approved ISPs, and they can drop a 10 gig fiber circuit right into your building that runs point to point straight to Amazon, to one of their approved data centers. Microsoft has it under a different name. I can't remember the name there. With that, you get a fast, dedicated link right into that cloud provider's network. That is awesome. There's a little bit of latency, but we're talking about just a millisecond or two. It's so small that it really creates that on-prem experience even for these remote servers. But boy, is it expensive. They don't post pricing online, mostly because the different ISPs charge different amounts. And then Amazon charges a monthly amount. They bill you for bandwidth on top of all that. So it does get to be expensive, but you can really get some performance out of it. So that's usually the big variation between these VPN tunnels over existing WAN. They're slower, but they're easier, and you can bring them up and down whenever you want, versus the dedicated links that are far more expensive, but far faster and more reliable.
All right, we keep getting questions here. Frank from Gainesville, interestingly
right?
enough. Do you
Gainesville, Georgia?
No, it's Gainesville, Florida. I'm pretty sure that's what it says. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. Who knows? Do you have any preferred tools for migrating data, such as shared folders?
I do. I have a couple that I've used. Multcloud. Multcloud is one of my favorites. If you've ever used them, I'm trying to remember the actual URL. It's multcloud. I think it's multcloud.com, if I remember. I don't want to send you guys to you end up on some crazy weird website instead of where I actually want you to go. But what they do is they allow you to connect multiple cloud providers, or you can even connect to like an SFTP server, and you can move files and folders and things. I like it because it does everything directly between the cloud providers. So if you've already got things in, like we had a bunch of data in Dropbox, and I wanted to move that into OneDrive, or move it between a Google storage account and a Azure file vault. And you can connect up and you can transfer the data, and then you just log out of the web page. It keeps running in the background. It is multcloud.com. So they're a neat service that does that, and they're incredibly inexpensive for what they do. So that's one service. But I'll tell you, services like these, you have to be careful with. When you're moving between cloud providers, the odds of you maintaining permissions are really, really low, right? So you'll likely have to redefine permissions, and hopefully your provider has a way where you can export what those permissions are so that you can then reapply them at the new provider, because they're rarely compatible. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft all store their data in completely different ways. If you actually run these as true file servers, right? If it's actual Linux distros or Windows servers or whatever, you'd probably be better off doing an archive and preserving the permissions, and then unarchiving on the other side so the permissions are maintained. But that's something you want to keep an eye out for. But if you just want to quickly move data between cloud providers, I've used multi-cloud a number of times, and they work really well.
And, well, look, we have another question here regarding the cost question. Is the quick answer to an executive that going to the cloud saves money in the long run? Or more or less, on-prem, long run, going to save us money, or cloud?
I've had a weird relationship with executives over the years. I usually don't go in on cost, because in my opinion, it's worth it to pay more if you get a better solution, right? So I never try and go in and say, this is going to be cheaper, because usually the way that's interpreted is this is not going to be as good, right? We're giving something up to save on cost. So when I kind of propose a cloud migration, there's usually a few other reasons that I do it. I always say, for example, how would you like to have network staff that's monitoring your servers 24 hours a day? You don't have that right now. You could if you were in the cloud, right? How would you like it if like a power supply or a hard drive failed and somebody took care of it 24/7? You didn't have to worry about it. That's what you get in the cloud. How would you like it if you needed another web server, and instead of having to fill out a purchase order and get a quote from HP or Dell and order the server and wait a week and it comes in, and then you got to install the operating system, instead of all that, you just click launch instance, and now you've got another one, right? How would you like all those things? To be agile, to be able to react quickly to things. That's what the cloud lets you do. And even if it's more expensive, those things that I just listed, those are worth it. It just happens that it's less expensive, right? And so that's kind of the icing on the cake. All of that is a good reason to go to the cloud. But even in spite of all that, you'll still find a lot of CIOs are hesitant to go to the cloud because it's risk. Things are changing. And what if something goes wrong? They don't want to be the CIO that goes down for totally destroying the network or allowing the network to be destroyed around them. They know they've got those servers right there. They can see them. They see the blinking lights. If there's a red light, they know something's wrong. When it's all in the cloud, it's kind of like you lose that safety net. You just don't know, is everything okay? Are there red blinking lights? So some of that you just kind of have to talk to. And that's why I always say, move 1 or 2 servers, test it out, see how it goes. Take your time. It's okay to have a cloud migration take an entire year, right? Just take your time, go through and do it, and you'll find that it becomes pretty easy to win over those CIOs.
All right, and here we have another question. Frank again from Gainesville. Frank, thank you for the questions. You're always picking
What if
our
they're all
brain.
different Franks?
It could be different Franks. I mean, I never even thought of that. Who knows? Other Frank from Gainesville. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the upcoming Windows Virtual Desktop offering?
I got a few opinions on it. It could be great. It could be terrible. I don't know until I get a chance to see it. So there have been a number of providers. I'm trying to remember the name of one. Liquid Sky. Liquid Sky was a provider that said, you know what? People play video games, and their computers need to have fast CPUs and fast video cards and all this stuff to play a video game. But then the rest of the time, their computer is just using a web browser. So you're paying for a lot of hardware you don't really use. And they said, what if we run all that hardware in the cloud, and your computer just shows a remote screen? And so you're remotely accessing that hardware. And they did it, and it worked, right? It ran fluidly, you had great frame rate, and you didn't have to have a high-end computer. So you didn't need to upgrade your computer every 2 years. You could just run on this cloud solution the rest of your life, and you'd be fine. Well, that's what Microsoft is doing with their Windows in the Cloud solution. So your Windows desktop will just be hosted by them, and on your computer, which could be a super low end laptop or even a Chromebook or something like that, and you could pull up your Windows desktop and run your applications. Now that sounds great, and it could be right, but some of the vendors like Liquid Sky, their commercial offering, I think, is shut down right now, and it's because they haven't quite figured out the pricing model. Now, Microsoft obviously has a ton of money, and so they can fund a lot of different models. But let's see what it works out to. But I always remember this talk. You remember Sun Microsystems?
I do.
Sun Microsystems, they got acquired by Oracle, which means they got destroyed. But back in the 80s and 90s, they made some of the best servers that were out there, servers that I worked with. And their CEO at the time said, computers should not be the way they are right now. Computers should be like telephones. And for our younger viewers, you might not know this, but we used to have telephones in our houses that were like attached to the wall. And if you wanted a phone, you would call AT&T or whoever, and they would put a phone jack in your house. And then you could go to the store and you could buy whatever phone you wanted. And there'd be 20 phones on the wall or on the shelves. You could pick whatever color, whatever model, wireless, wired, whatever. It didn't matter. You just grabbed a phone. And then you went home and you plugged the phone in, and your phone number and all of that was already set up and working. You could start getting calls and making calls right from the moment you plugged it in. And the CEO of Sun Microsystems said that's how computers should be. They should be like telephones. You turn them on and they just work. Everything comes from the network, right? And they had this slogan, the network is the computer. Well, this was 20 years ago, and it all died when Oracle bought them. Well, now we're starting to see these other companies like Microsoft, which are basically saying the same thing. Your computer should be a telephone. I don't care what computer you have. Maybe it's got an ARM processor, an Intel processor, an AMD, who cares, right? But you plug in, you connect up, and all of a sudden, here's your Windows desktop. And when there's a new security update or a big upgrade, Microsoft just does it on their end, and you see it. There's entire companies like Citrix that build themselves around this idea. So I know it can be successful, but it's going to boil down to the implementation. And Microsoft has not given enough out yet for us to really know how that's going to go. So I've got my eye on it. I want to see. But it has a lot of the same problems. Actually, it has more of the problems that we talked about earlier. Like on your regular end user station, you're far more likely to have proprietary hardware that you wouldn't be able to use in a cloud deployment versus a server where you're less likely to have proprietary hardware. Things like that fax board that I mentioned earlier, or the software licensing dongle, that kind of thing is less common on a regular desktop. Is more common on a regular desktop. So those will all be obstacles that we run into. But it'll be an interesting year because a lot of that's going to pan out later here in 2019.
Well, Don, thank you so much for giving us insights to those questions and answer sessions. And we answer those questions and more at IT Pro TV. And if you want to learn more about IT Pro TV, well, I definitely recommend that you join us. We have CompTIA, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple, Linux, Security, Cloud, and so much more, including a webinar that Ronnie did on Desktop as a Service. So that's even included there. And make sure you use that promo code Webinar30. Whether you're an individual looking kind of just to level up your game, or you're a business that needs your team training, definitely join us here at IT Pro TV. Well, Don, I've had a blast here. Have you had a blast?
Absolutely. Me and the 12 francs.
But just like every good thing, sometimes it's got to come to the end. So I say we go ahead and wrap this one up. So signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Justin Dennison.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. All the questions we didn't get to will be answered via Twitter at #ProsKnow. Remember that coupon code is Webinar30. See you back here for the next IT Pro TV webinar.